Hello and welcome to another video lecture as part of the Regional Debate Development Series, particularly focused on helping you guys in the regions for New Zealand debating. What I'm going to be covering today is motion types. It's something that I think is very important to cover, but I think that's something for like very experienced debaters that becomes quite intuitive. I think once you know it, and once you do it a bunch of times, it just becomes automatic knowledge that you do it this way. However, when you're learning for the first time, it's really, really important to get it right. There are lots of mistakes you can make because there are all sorts of different types of wording for emotion. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to run you through the very common types that occur. This will comprise like 98% of your emotions, probably going to be one of these that come out. Are there exceptions? Yes. Are they extremely rare? Yes. Before I get started though, as always, listening is great, taking notes is better, and practicing it later is the very best. So for right now, the only thing you can do, because you can't practice right now, so you're listening to me, hopefully, is I would encourage you to take up your pen, your paper, and take some notes. Without further ado, let's jump into the motion types. I'm going to check you through each one. What are the key things you've got to remember when you do it? Firstly, this house would motions. Obviously, there are all sorts of motions, right? Thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of them out there these days. So, like, for example, this house would implement a sugar tax, and this house would ban smoking, are both this house would motions, right? Anything that starts with the words this house would, also known as THW, sometimes they abbreviate it for debaters, so don't seem confused if that's what they've abbreviated it as. Any of these motions, number of things you need to do. Number one, if you're on side affirmative, you have to provide a model. When you're doing this model, you need to do a couple of things. Obviously, I'll cover the bulk of how to model in my modeling lecture, how to do a model. But in this, you need to kind of outline any key details for the creation and how you're going to run this motion. So for example, it might be a rollout of a sugar tax over 5 years. That is really good because it says, that's how we're going to do it. And like mitigates out some issues of like, it taking a bit of it being done instantly often has issues. So because of that, that's a big help. However, things that you probably shouldn't model out, I'm going to cover this in my modeling lecture, things that you probably shouldn't model out are specifics of things that are way too specific for you to handle. Because you open yourself out to harms you don't need to. Like for example, how much exactly is the percent we're going to put on sugar tax? I don't know who you are, but my pick would be that none of you are government economist advisors for the New Zealand government on sugar tax. So because of that, I think you probably don't know what the best number for that should be. So what you can actually say is, we will leave this to the government and their advisors to sort out. And if someone says that's not okay, you're like, well, they're like super well equipped to do this because it's literally their job to work out the specifics of this number. Like whether that's a good number is a different, whether you have the number at all is a different question. But it'll be the best number that you should have for this, if that makes sense. So you should always model. And note that when you're on site negating, you can also model. You get something called fiat power, which is pretty much whatever the house is doing, you get kind of equivalent amount of power to do something else. Don't do something that they can also do. So don't say, they say we're doing a sugar tax. Don't say you're going to educate people on sugar. They'll just say us too. Like do something that can't both be done at the same time, for example. So does that make sense? The fiat power means if they're going to spend $100 million, you get $100 million to spend. Obviously, some of them are a bit more like ethereal than $100 million. But my advice most of the time is you don't need a counter model. It's normally just like pretty obvious that you're just running the opposite side. But that's something you should know that you have the ability to do in this motion that you don't have the ability to do in others. Next, back slide. Next, you need to provide issues with the status quo. You prove issues with the status quo. So if you're doing something, you're changing something probably. So you need to prove that there are issues with the current status quo, and your goal is that whatever you would do would fix them the best, right? The other side is saying this isn't the best way to fix them, it makes it worse, etc. All of these things are legitimate. Finally, So the end goal, like every round, is to prove that you create a better world for everyone in it. Maximum utility. Like, how do we help the most people the most? Perfect. Now next slide. This house believes that, once again, it could be anything coming after it, but also breathed as THB. THB is generally how it's breathed. They don't abbreviate the T into it. They normally just write it for some reason. But this house believes that, whatever. First key difference, no model for this. You do not get to like have fiat power in this. It's not a government policy that you're like trying to implement and deal with the specifics of. So you don't have fiat power to kind of add things or tweak things to it. That means the opposition also doesn't get that fiat power. That's important to know. Secondly, feasibility of implementation doesn't matter. So we assume that this policy can be implemented, will be effective. So this house believes that a sugar tax would be good. We're arguing if a sugar tax, like, oh, this house believes that a ban on smoking would be good is actually a better example. The feasibility of like achieving this policy is not up for debate. The things that are up for debate is whether that would be a good thing or a bad thing. It's more about the principles behind it, not about the specific logistical outcomes in the same way that it is more when you're talking about models. You always, as same as the other one, you generally have issues with the status quo. You're trying to prove that you make a better world. So nice and similar in that way. Next slide. This house prefers blank over blank. Not what common one that everyone's heard. This house prefers cats over dogs. Super common one. Once again, prefers, because it's not this house would, no model, no fiat power, forget about that for now. Feasibility, once again, same as the last one, doesn't matter. You once again have an issue with the status quo. So in all those ways, it's pretty much what this house believes question. You're like, well, Elliot, why is it any different? You're probably wondering. The answer to that is it's more restrictive, particularly on negation. So this house prefers is pretty much, if you're on A, it's the same. But if you're on neg, you have to stand by over the other thing. So if this house prefers dogs, that's fine. But that the other negating side can say prefers dogs over ostriches as pets, as giraffes as pets, as lions. You can claim whatever you like as a pet. But if they say over dogs, you as negating have to defend dogs. You can't tell me you're defending anything else. Can't tell me you're defending something new, something additional. You have to defend that. That's end of story. It's just that something that judges do if they want to. The tournament directors will do it if they want to see a very specific thing debated against each other. They don't want a bunch of flexibility. Okay. This house regrets. I think this is one that people often struggle with. Because normally motions are looking out into the future, but this one actually looks over into the past. So to remind you that, I'm actually going to walk all the way across the other side. So that when you watch this video, you're like, why is Elliot standing on the other side? Because the whole time you should be remembering that we're looking backwards, we're not over there looking forwards. This house prefers a world where X never existed is also another way to phrase this that I've often seen, but that fits under this house regrets category. This is about a debate around what the world would have looked like if a given event did not happen. So it often talks about an event that happened. So for example, you know, this house, a common motion I've had is that this house regrets, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion hiring policies. They think, you know, that that's a bad thing. And, you know, people will often argue, you know, that that's harmed these groups of minorities more because of the backlash, etc. There are lots of arguments that can be made on both sides of the debate. But as you can see, we're not talking about should we implement DEI policies going forward. We're saying we regret that they were implemented into the past, right? And so we're looking at kind of all the different pros and cons. So the key is, no one actually knows exactly what this world looks like. So you get the opportunity to paint a nice picture of what that might look like. In debating, we call this the counterfactual. And I like to say, in this house regrets, counterfactual is key. It's one of the things you must do every time. I don't care if you're on side A, I don't care if you're on side negating. If you're on side negating, you technically can say, we agree with side affirmative's counterfactual, but most of the time you probably don't, because they're telling you the world would look like something that probably doesn't, you don't want it to look like. So this is what the debate is over. What would the world have looked like if this had never happened? This could be like, what replaces this thing? This could be, what politics change? How do people act differently? How does it affect these groups? Like, imagine the world and step back all the things that would have changed that are good or bad in the debate. And you want to prove that that is a better world on side affirmative when that doesn't happen, and a worse world when it is taken away on side negative. I'm sure that makes perfect sense. Now, while the next slide changes, I'm going to walk back across because we're back into the present. Active debates. These are a debate as well. I've left it to the end, as well as the regret space. Another one I find debaters often have difficulty wrapping their head around. These debates about an individual with a description that is given. Note, they are things like, for example, they could be any of the above motions. They could be, this house regrets as such and such. You know, this house as John Key regrets such and such. This house as Kim Jong-un regrets such and such. This house as a local chef in a small town province regrets such and such, or would do such and such with their life. Anyone is up for grabs. They will give you a description of this actor in the motion. They will, unless they're a well-known individual that everyone knows. And you have to debate the debate from their perspective. So for example, let's use my Kim Jong-un example from before. Kim Jong-un probably doesn't really care about the well-being of the New Zealand general public. What does he care about? Now that is up for debate. This is probably what it's going to be about. It's all about what's best for this individual, or more importantly, I would add, what they think is best for themselves. So you can like do a little bit of a frame and be like, oh, this person thinks this is best for themselves, even though this other thing might be, because people are a little bit irrational sometimes. That's my hot tip for you on how to do active debates really well. But back to the motion type. Debates are about what they value. So often I put in my framing what they're valuing, what is important to them, why is that important to them, really mechanize it out, get really, really clear. That's going to imbalance the scales. If they care, let's say I'm a small town chef, and should I take a job at a big restaurant? Or should I open my own local kitchen that won't make as much money, but I get free reign on my cooking? So do I care about creativity? Do I care about money? That's probably a pretty important question to ask. And then who provides that better? Once it's like settled on what they want, then it's all about proving how you get that to them. I think that's really perfect. That's it in my slideshow, but I do have a couple final things to say, so just stay with me for a moment. One, I think it's really important that every time you go in, you tick all these boxes. And if you work on this every time, it'll eventually become super intuitive. The problem is, I've often seen debaters who debate very well, but don't tick these boxes. Like they give me a model on a this house belief motion, and they lose because they thought that model was relevant. That's not good. We don't want you guys doing that. So you guys are excellent debaters, and we would hate for you to see you mixing up these things. So make sure you get these things. I encourage you to go out now and practice these things. I encourage you to create motions with different ones, different, like this house regrets, this house believes, or just even quiz your teammates on what the different characteristics are. So say, oh, you know, what are the things we got to worry about in Activate? Am I allowed to model in the this house belief debate? Just ask yourself a few questions and kind of get your head around these. Feel free to stick them on cue cards and just be like, every time you hear a motion like this house beliefs, and then like learn it. So every time you go to that debate, bang, you're able to like roll that out, make sure your team is ticking all those boxes. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for tuning in this lecture. I hope it's helped you a lot. If you've got any questions, please put them in the comments. I will do my best to respond to them, but I admit I can be a little bit slow on my response times, mainly because this is not an active YouTube channel. It's just a place I use to store things because it's a nice and easy way to facilitate video sharing. Without further ado, best of luck with your next debate. I'm sure you're going to do much better because of this video, and I will see you in our next lecture. Thank you.